My friends, this afternoon we pause to acknowledge our debt and to express our thanks to the late Professor Geoffrey Gray. The biography in this conference booklet says a great deal about him. That he has been Professor of History in the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at UNSW Canberra, that he is the author or editor of no less than 26 books in the fields of Australian comparative and international military history, and has published numerous articles, chapters and reviews in these fields. He has also been an Associate Director of ACSACS and President of the Society of Military History, and something that he told me more than once, the first non-American to hold the post. That says a great deal about Geoff Gray, and yet it says not much at all. He was such, in my judgment at least, a complex person who was many things to many people, evidenced by those that have joined us this afternoon to pause, to reflect and to give thanks. To know a little bit more about Geoff and what mattered to him in life, we can look at some of the books that he published. And he will have conversations with hundreds and thousands of people in the years and decades to come who will read his books and enter into a conversation with him. He will continue to educate, enlighten and challenge. And of all the things perhaps that will draw a wider audience to his memory, it will be this fine scholarship that we've assembled before you, which doesn't actually include book reviews, articles and all manner of other writings that also meant much to him. These books are part of his legacy. But can I suggest an even bigger part is that of his family and friends. When we gather for his funeral, it will be a time for his family to speak of that which they have experienced. But as just a simple gathering of friends this afternoon, we are mindful that he was not just someone whose words meant something to us, but a person who touched our lives. My good friend Peter Stanley will shortly publish a book called Collected Acknowledgements, in which he talks about the people that have contributed to his work. It's a great title that no one's yet fallen upon for a book. And yet it's true, isn't it, that we are all of us unique, but an amalgam of those we have met, admired and imitated. Because we have been shaped by others. And with you, I count myself privileged to have known Geoff, to be his colleague, and also to delight in calling him my friend. I first met him in 1988 in the Department of History here at the Academy, which contained greats like Alan Gilbert and Roger Thompson, both of whom died far too young. And there was Peter Dennis, who was to me my PhD co-supervisor. I'd never met Geoff before, and he said, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "I'm doing a PhD on the destroyer Voyager." And he said, "Why?" And I said, "It was sunk in a collision." And he said, "Well, it was dark, wasn't it?" He said, "You better tell me why you're doing this." And then when I completed my PhD 20 months later, I was walking down the corridor in Building 28 and he saw these volumes, and it was nearly as big as David Horner's PhD. No, not really. And he grabbed the volume off the top and he said, "I'll find you a typo." I thought, "You bastard." And he opened it up and he went, "There!" And it had Voyager closed Melbourne. He said, "Shouldn't it be Voyager closed on Melbourne?" I said, "No, Geoff, it's technical." He said, "Just wait." More recently, we've worked together, and I followed Jeff, who was, of course, the foundation director of the centre I now lead. He wrote a chapter in a collection that we published just a few months ago called Anzac Day Then and Now. Can I just read you a section of the book and his chapter? He begins, "I first started going to the dawn service at the Australian War Memorial in 1974. In those days it was a sparsely attended event, easily accommodated within the sandstone cloisters which housed the tablets of the Roll of Honour. I could turn up with perhaps 15 minutes to spare and readily gain entry to the proceedings. Still in the middle years of high school, I was easily the youngest attendee among a group of mostly Second World War veterans and their families, together with younger members of the regular armed forces posted to Canberra. National servicemen from the nation's recent and ill-starred foray to South Vietnam, easily identifiable with their two distinctive service medals, were conspicuously absent, at least in those years. The service was intimate, with only a few hundred attendees holding candles in the courtyard and cloisters. When the candlelight bounced off the yellow sandstone in the darkness, it attained an added emotional, almost spiritual dimension. It was beautiful and moving in equal parts, and, like many of the best elements of the older Anzac Day commemoration, it's gone forever." Those words of Jeff's would have resonated with Charles Bean and that which he hoped to create at the War Memorial. But those words to me show Jeff's personal commitment to his craft, that he was a heartfelt writer, and that he insisted on being technically disciplined and intellectually rigorous. We have now fortunately attained a copy of what will be his last paper. It will be read tomorrow. But let me close as I share with you now what actually will be his final words for publication. They are so apt. He's talking about an experience of meeting an Indonesian general and asking him about confrontation in the context of that volume in the official history, but he's also talking about writing the official history of the Navy in South Vietnam. And he says, "I regard both volumes fondly, though in truth I haven't opened either of them for a few years. And whilst we all worked in continuance of the Australian tradition, in no sense did I feel I was wearing the mantle of C.E.W. Bean, or perhaps more accurately of Cutlack or Jose or Gullet. I felt no requirement to name-check individuals unless it made sense to do so, nor to detail every separate border patrol, many of which were tediously uneventful. The same applied to the disparate activities of RAN personnel in Malaysian and Vietnamese waters. In both volumes, I sought to give a sense of both individual actions and of the wider context, in pursuit of explaining not only what Australian servicemen did, but why they did it. In this, I would like to think I succeeded, but that, as always, is for others to judge." Peter Stanley.
Thanks, Tom. We wanted to use this session to invite Jeff's colleagues and friends to reflect on his life and his career and his achievements in any way. So after I've finished speaking, there may well be silences, and I want us to be comfortable with them because people will want to organise their thoughts. We have taken the precaution of identifying some more passages from Jeff's work, which Garth and Michael, I know, will be reading out, and possibly others will be too. Because like the passage that Tom read out, everything that Jeff wrote expressed his personality. Thinking about this last night, I reflected that military historians are unusually familiar with death and loss, but usually we face it in the abstract or in the distanced by time and the cushion of documents. And Jeff's untimely death brings us up sharp. We knew him, we respected him, we liked him, we admired him. And the mood in the school over the last few days has been very sombre. It's knocked us all sideways. As Tom may have mentioned, that had he lived, Jeff would at this very minute be giving us the benefit of his decided views on the subject of Charles Bean. And he'd rehearsed this argument to me in the days and weeks before the conference. The synopsis he gave me began, "Bean's official history is heavily lauded, often by people who haven't read it," which is about 7 words which summarises Jeff's approach to history. He would have imparted the argument he would have gone on to make in his own inimitable manner, trenchantly, pithily, wittily, challengingly. Now, I have to say, Tom and I have genteelly differed on this. I'm glad that we haven't been able to find the paper that Jeff would have given at this very moment, because I don't think I could have got through reading it with composure. So I'm relieved that I don't have to read out more of Jeff's words. But what I do want to say, though, is that like a lot of people here, and I hope we'll hear from other people who knew him, I owe Jeff a great deal, not least because I'm here at UNSW Canberra because of him. And I want to reflect on the fact that our relationship, which seems to have developed into one of mutual respect and, on my part, admiration, our relationship actually didn't begin all that propitiously. As some here may recall, Jeff was appointed to this place, the UNSW-staffed Australian Defence Force Academy, in the early to mid-1980s. And some people who were around at the time were frankly surprised that a young but certainly confident young man should have prevailed. Now, in this, I think Alan Gilbert, whom Tom mentioned, saw potential in Jeff that I certainly missed. Because Alan was right, because Jeff quickly blossomed and in a very few years had demonstrated, partly through that productivity, but also the students of his, some of whom are in the room, he demonstrated the truth of the promise that Alan had discerned in him. Well, having backed the wrong horse, as it were, there was a coolness between Jeff and I, and not the least, I think, because we were both ambitious young men on the make. But that coolness persisted until it became absolutely blindingly obvious that Jeff was a scholar of distinction and enormous talent. And before the decade was out, Jeff and I had buried the hatchet. And I think having children at exactly the same time played a part in that. So during the 1990s, we had a lot more to do with Jeff. And I remember the moment very clearly when Jeff went from being a colleague in a kindred institution to being a friend. I think it was in 1997, when I was at the Australian War Memorial. We were given money from Britain to take a delegation of historians to London to take part in a conference at the Imperial War Museum. And it was absolutely obvious that Jeff should be part of that 4 or 5 member delegation. And I remember, and it was in July, so it was a beautiful summer evening, we were sitting outside a pub near the old Public Record Office when Craig Wilcox, who's here today, who was another on our team, asked Jeff and I, he said, "What's the most evocative battlefield you've ever visited?" And Jeff and I said, at exactly the same moment, Culloden. And we looked at each other, and I think I can date our friendship from that moment. Well, I think many of you here, many of us will recall moments when Jeff became and then remained part of our lives, and of course he always will be. So Tom and I invite you all to share your thoughts and reflections about Jeff. Thanks. And as I say, we're comfortable with silence, so please don't feel impelled to come up, and if you'd want to take your time to do that, please do.
Good afternoon. My name's Peter Dennis. I was actually on Jeff's appointments committee in 1982, and I was telling, I think, Chris earlier about what happened. We'd advertised for what was called then a teaching fellow, which was a junior person to take tutorials and also enrol in a PhD. and we'd specified the sort of area of interest that we were looking for. Well, the first candidate, who on paper was absolutely what we wanted, turned out to be about the dullest person I've ever interviewed. When asked the standard question at the end of the interview, "Do you have anything to ask us?" he said, "Yes, how much will I get paid?" Well, that was his name off the list. And the next person was this young, brash Geoffrey Gray. One of my colleagues, the late John Robertson, always asked interviewees about books. And he'd say, "Have you read this book, and what do you think of it?" It was extraordinary. Geoff knew every book that we could throw at him. Not only knew it, he would say, "Well, Michael Howard's book on the Franco-Prussian War, it's very good, but I don't like what he said about this because I think he's wrong." Now, here's a 23-year-old correcting one of the doyens of military history. So Geoff joined our department, and for my sins, I was made his PhD supervisor. And I said to him, "Look, Geoff," he wanted to write on the Korean War. I said, "I know virtually nothing about the Korean War, but perhaps I know something about history." And so we actually got on very well. Geoff knew the records. He was an assiduous researcher, already a good writer. And all went well until about a month before he was going to submit. He came to me one afternoon and he said, "Oh, I've written the introduction. Can you just have a quick look and I'll submit the thesis?" I said, "Well, better sit down, Geoff." He sat down and I started reading it, and I said, "Well, if I was your examiner, I'd fail you on the first sentence." "Oh, what's wrong with that?" I said, "Well, you make a sweeping statement about the nature of alliances. It's wrong, and here's some examples. This one, this one, this one." "Oh," I said, the sort of grunt that we got to know. And we went through this, and after 3/4 of an hour, we'd got to the bottom of page 1. And he said, "I can't take this anymore, I'm leaving." I said, "Well, it's fine. I won't sign the certificate until it's satisfactory." He had 3 goes over the next 3 weeks. He came back with the 4th one and he said, "I don't care if you don't like it, I'm going to submit anyway." Well, in fact, it was very good, and he sailed through. And of course, that was the beginning. I think the book's over there, Commonwealth Armies and the Korean War, which is still unsurpassed. I think Geoff's greatest contribution was not the books. Dare I say, lots of people write lots of books. It's in the sort of scholarly family that you see lining up at the back. Geoff's PhD students and students that he mentored as teaching fellows or tutors. For the last couple of years, as my colleagues in the school would know, Geoff was very concerned about the question of renewing the history profession. And he spent an enormous amount of time encouraging young people, with the result that we see now in the official history unit in particular, a whole new band of young people, not old people like me, young people who are going to be the future of history. And I think that's Geoff's really lasting legacy, long after, frankly, the books will be thrown out by the library, because students don't read books anymore anyway. If it's not online, they're not interested. So it's these people, Tom and William and others, they're what Geoff has really left us. Thank you.
You can clap.
Thanks, Tom. Well, in all, just a few moments and a few words. I mentioned to somebody out the side before I came in, as I reflected on it my way to Adford this afternoon, that I'd known Geoff for well over more than half of my life. Not adult life, but life. I first met Geoff as a 19-year-old undergraduate here. I knew him for the 3 years of that degree. I knew him when I did my honours degree back here, along with the also sadly departed Jerry Walsh. I knew him in another guise as my own PhD supervisor, in the last decade or so and more as a colleague and as a friend. I think what I'd like to remember about Jeff, or what I will remember about Jeff, is something that I think Tom said earlier, and that's the complexity of the man. I look around the room and I know there are people here who know him very, very well, and others who might know him more in passing. It is no surprise to anybody that Jeff presented a pretty hard shell to the world. Sometimes that could be a spiky shell, depending on the topic of conversation or his mood. Unfortunately, for some undergrads or others, that might have been all they ever saw of Jeff. No one doubted the man's intellect or his capacity, but that shell was always there. But that shell hid what was underneath. There were layers and layers to Jeff, and that's what I understood the more I got to know him, more as a colleague and a friend as well. There was a core in that shell that was as soft and sentimental and feeling as anybody else you'd like to meet. It came out from time to time, but it was pretty guarded. So I guess amongst the accomplishments and the books and the other accolades that will come, the thing that I'll take away, I think, is that multiple layers of a real human being. That's all. Thanks.
My name's Roger Lee. I used to be with the Army History Unit. I'm now working for Craig in the Official History section. Jeff Gray was probably my closest friend. For the last 15 years I've been having lunch with him every week or 2 weeks, in which we would engage in character assassination of our colleagues and friends. You don't know what he said. He used to derail my attempts to lose weight by going on the wagons, by dumping scorn on me for what a futile exercise. I endorse exactly what Craig said. He came across as this hard-nosed, arrogant, evil bastard, and he was none of those things when you got to know him. You had to work hard to gain his respect. The old saying, he didn't, what's the word? Doesn't treat fools gladly, or something, suffer fools gladly. Yeah. I'm losing it. And that's certainly true. You make a stupid statement to him and you got it back in spades very quickly. But on the other hand, I've never met somebody with such compassion. One of his PhD students, who was allegedly doing a job for us in the Army History Unit at the time, had a nervous breakdown, sitting in the corner of his room, not coping at all. Jeff and Peter went out of their way to help that guy right through all those problems and brought him on. He's now a successful academic. And Jeff was like that. He was just a genuinely nice guy. Finally, I had a very complex relationship with him. At one stage, he was my PhD supervisor and a contractor working for me, and I had to pay him. So that put us in a very interesting position. A large number of those books that are on the desk there were funded by the Army History Unit because Jeff thought it was a good idea and no one was game to say to him it wasn't. He had a great relationship within the military. If I told him he was being a clown, he'd go to CA and I'd get a kick. He had an incredible ability to build networks and alliances. You cannot go anywhere in the world of military history and not find friends, colleagues and spies who will report back on you, to him. Some of my indiscretions in Europe came back here very quickly. I don't think we'll ever see the light of somebody like him again. He is a unique combination of the military background through his father, his own genuine intellectual ability, and his capacity to engender loyalty and friends amongst everybody he met. So thank you all for coming.
Someone has to mention rugby and Edgars. Tom Richardson.
My name's Tom Richardson. I worked for Jeff over the last 5 years. And mentioning Edgars, I last saw him when I had a beer with him 2 weeks ago at said location in his natural habitat, so to speak. I, like all my colleagues at the Official History, I was shattered to hear of his death. And reflecting on that, whereas Tom, you met him in 1988, which was the year I was born, I've only known him for 5 years, but I was thinking about how much he has influenced me in that time. Everyone seems to have the story about the fearsome professor, and when you crack the ice with him, my first year here as a PhD student, he was a pretty fearsome presence, didn't say much. When he did say it, it did tend to come in those sort of grunts that Peter described, until finally towards the end of the year he said, an email popped up in my inbox and said, I understand you wrote a paper about Giarabub. And I said, yes, Professor. Would you like it? He said, yes, I would. So I sent him a copy. And then the next morning, he sees me in the staff room and stabs a finger at me and says, what are you doing next year? And there are lots of answers to that question, but I felt it was best to say not much. And he said, good, you're working for me. And that was the start of a relationship that I've benefited hugely from and has been hugely influential on me. And I know I speak in that respect for a lot of my colleagues, so like Will, Tristan, Maggie, Misha, Ashley. He put a huge amount of time into us. He understood we were the future of the profession, but he also was very passionate about making sure we didn't get kicked to the curb. And he just did have a huge, huge influence on us. The other thing we thought we should mention, because there is no one in the room to voice this, is the influence he had on his undergraduates. I was lucky enough to have a coffee with a young lieutenant this morning who was an honours student here last year and who I first met in 2012 while tutoring one of Jeff's subjects. He did have that lasting legacy, and although he did cultivate the persona of a fearsome professor, they understood that he was the real deal, and they, most of them, greatly enjoyed his teaching, even as the low marks rolled in. So he's just going to be a tremendous loss, and even though many of us in this room did not know him for very long, he's had a huge influence on us. Thanks.
My name's James Goldrick. I was been twice Commandant of the Academy and also had the Academy under my command when I was the Commander of the Defence College. I have a long relationship with Jeff, not only in his work at ADFA but in history as well. And I really want to follow up on behalf of the Defence Force with a point about what Jeff did. Indeed, he's one of the people who made this place work and made this place worthwhile, because Jeff's influence, and I accept I have the historical profession here, but I have to tell you that I think his influence in terms of the intellectual development of the Australian Defence Force might actually be an even more important contribution than his formal contribution to the profession of history. Because it is true, he did have a persona that was pretty formidable, and he did terrify more than one midshipman or cadet. But in fact, they all appreciated him enormously. And while he may have given low marks to start off with, I used to look course by course at the midshipmen and cadets' results every semester. And I can tell you that, in fact, Jeff did not end up marking his students lower, even if only because he'd terrified them all into working as hard as they should. But that contribution, I think, will always be difficult to quantify. But I can tell you it is there already. It is apparent already in the officers of the Defence Force, and it will be apparent for many more years yet. And in many ways, I think that is probably a legacy he would be even more proud of than any of the remarkable things he's done formally in history. Thank you.
Garth.
Yeah, like a lot of people that, I was shit scared of Jeff when I first came across him. It was probably part of the environmental thing as well too, because I first met Jeff when I started working at the War Memorial, was working with Peter at the time. This was obviously before Peter and Jeff's reapproachment, so there was probably, he's the demon, but I was really, really, really scared of Jeff. But over the years, like everybody, I've come to recognise what a complex, diverse individual he is. And have come to the sort of really appreciated his advice, his support and his friendship. Now, I think it sort of gives a bit of Jeff's character. I just go back to, if I look, he examined my PhD, and if I look at the report, the examiner's report, my PhD, it was the shortest of the one that I had. That I had one examiner who wrote 10 pages of various bits. Jeff's was a few lines. I can't remember it exactly, but it went along the lines of something. This is one of the most shoddily presented PhDs I have seen in a very long time. But it was also one of the most significant and indeed most enjoyable I've read in that time. And I think that's a never held back with the cane when the cane was needed, but at the same time recognise that and good work. But I think going back to this thing of Jeff and Jeff's diversity, and I just like to contrast this with the fact I thought he was such an ogre when I first met him, that in more recent times, I've recently been married, looking at the prospect of fatherhood in my 40s, and Jeff has been a source of advice and insights, etc. As he's been going through having a young son at a later point in life, and that I think also sort of sums up Jeff the softie, that you would be talking to him about such things and about how it was scaring the bajingas out of me. And you talk to him about Seb and about being a father, and his eyes would light up, and there was a whole different Jeff who was miles and miles away from this ogre that I originally met back at the early 90s.
With Jeff, I was never sure which of the two old guys in the Muppets, I only learnt the names of these guys yesterday. What do they call Misha? Statler and Waldorf, because I'm 3 years younger than Jeff, and he didn't have the scary. I just thought, you're just an old buffer, I used to say to him, and a curmudgeon. And he'd go, like this, and some other noises only he could do. There's perhaps time for just one or two others if you'd like to come forward.
Good afternoon. The photo you see is of Jeff's office, and I had the task of entering his office Wednesday morning with Shirley Ramsey. And what you can't really see are probably about knee-high books with a little path to his desk. It's a classic professor's office. His glasses were left on his desk. Now, I have only known Jeff since January, and there is that expression, don't poke the Russian bear. For me, when I engaged with Jeff, it was like a red rag for me. I couldn't help but poke the bear. One day I thought there was actually thunder inside our building, and I mentioned it to Tom. I said, look, I don't think Professor Gray's in a good way today, and I was told it's just Jeff. But what I will remember, and I'll remember every day, is that he took the time to come into my office. And on a section of my shelf are all the things that I've collected in my travels and the time I lived in the US. So this gentleman spent time at West Point. It's not lost on me when you look out his office window, he can see the ad for Parade Ground. And so we were talking about all sorts of things. And it felt like hours had passed, but it wasn't. But he was asking things, and where did I get that from, and the books that I have, and the little bits. But he kind of made it, yes, I've got all this myself. So, what's really special about this? And I said, well, how about this? And I pulled a box out that actually has the flag that was flown above the state capitol in Texas the day that I visited, and it was given to me as a gift. And just that corner of the mouth went up a little bit of, not bad. He'll be forever present in my office. Thank you.
Just here.
I'll be quick. My name's Colin Garnett, and Jeff was my supervisor for 2 years. I heard about his reputation even before I came down here, all the way from Canada. Dr. Tim Cook taught me through my master's, and he said, you know what, I've made you a fairly good writer, but you're a lousy historian. So I'm going to send you to Jeff Gray. He taught me everything I know. Are you willing to move down to Australia? I said, sure, absolutely. And then I came halfway around the world to work with Jeff, specifically. I wanted to be a historian for my career. I wanted to work with the best. I already had worked with the best in Canada with Tim Cook. So I said, I'll work with Jeff. He'll teach me to be a proper historian, make this a career for myself. And he terrified me even before I came down here, because Tim said, for God's sakes, don't embarrass me. He doesn't suffer fools lightly. You will hear him say that probably in your first meeting, and he did. That very first meeting, I was trembling, knocking on his door, and I could barely get any words out. So I just said, all right. I said, hi, I'm Colin. He's like, I know. From then on, I thought, this guy's never going to say anything to me. I'm just going to walk in there, say a few things, and things going to be like, okay, go away. And gradually, we got to know each other a bit more, and the conversations got longer and longer and longer. And eventually, I had the wonderful privilege of being called mate a couple of times. He even called me dude once. It's probably in derision, because he never wasted an opportunity to tease me about being vegan by showing me pictures of steak or something. But he always was joking with me up until very recently as well. And I took that as a sign that maybe I've made it into the club, that he sees me as somebody worthy. Because I always looked at him as like a big father figure to me, even though I only knew him for about 2.5 years. His presence every time I went into his office was of a big titan in his field. And I just held on to every single word he said because I just wanted to learn. I'm going to miss him very dearly because nobody else in the department gave me support when I waxed lyrical about Canadian winters and snow and stuff like that. And Jeff was ever so fond of Canadian climate. So he was like, yes, 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 proper Canadian winter, beaver tail, hot chocolate, skating on the ice. So I'm dearly going to miss him.
And we'll conclude with our colleague Mesut.
My name is Mesut Diaz. I'm a Turkish military historian. I met Jeff in a bit different way than most of the persons here, his friends. Initially, Peter Dennis wrote me some emails asking some questions about the Ottoman military history. And later, Jeff took over it. And for nearly 6 months, we were email friends, exchanging ideas, sources. He was continually asking various questions about the Ottoman military. At the time, he was writing turned out to be his last published book. And later, when I was planning to move to America to retire from the Turkish military, he offered me a job here and managed to convince me to come here. From time to time, I regretted this decision. I mean, the same complaints down under, completely isolated continent with its peculiar ways and means. Anyway.
Which doesn't have military coups.
To say the truth, there's no special protection against the coups. I mean, be aware about civil-military relations. And for the last 4 years, I was sitting next to Jeff's office, working on my projects, and lots of his friends already told about his initial hard phase, layers of personality, and I witnessed various phases of it, some of them good, some of them bad. But what I find out, and I think it is the most important thing about Jeff, he is a unique military historian, somebody who is able to see the big picture while focusing on a single event or a single army. And if you read his last book, you will get the feeling that although the author is not an Ottoman expert, an expert Turkish military historian, but he able to see the picture from high and able to differentiate the trees with the forest. And I think his last book turned out to be one of his best because, like a good Scot, he preferred not to spend long pages, paragraphs on various issues. He always measures his words and as concise as possible to give the basic dynamics of the given event. And I think every death is early, but his death is for sure a very early one. Thank you.
To conclude, can I perhaps ask you to stand? We'll observe a moment of silence during which you may care to bring to mind a particular memory that you have of Jeff and to give thanks for it. Friends, thank you. We'll now have afternoon tea.